first of all, is everybody okay for heat? Because we can turn the radiators down if you're too warm. Are we? Roasting. Roasting. Can anybody who's at that side of that radiator turn it down a bit on the other side? And is it all right? If you want the door open for a while to let the air move, then... Right, thank you everybody for coming. I'm just going to pass you straight over to Craig. Thank you again for coming down and sparing your time. You're obviously busy with other things. We're going to have a talk for a while, an opportunity for questions, and then refreshments afterwards.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. Here's a lot to be to talk to you. I feel slightly guilty that I'm the only person in the room who has a whiskey. On the other hand, I don't feel sufficiently guilty not to drink it. It's a little bit the Dave Allen vibe going on, and it's a little bit, but it gives me something to do if I have to pause for a moment or two while I think what I'm going to say next. Because I genuinely, when I talk around the country, have very little idea what I'm going to say at the time I stand up. It sort of depends very much on what comes into my head and also what it seems the audience are more interested in and react to best. So it's a very, very unplanned evening. And what goes along with that is that it's not good to just talk at people for ages and ages. So although when we finish, I'll very happily take questions and I'll very happily talk about anything you'd like to discuss with me. Don't feel you necessarily have to wait until I've finished before you interject, and especially if I say something that you profoundly disagree with, feel free to get up and say so. I'm not somebody who objects to being disagreed with, largely because I've been wrong quite often in my life. So it would be foolish to take the view that people shouldn't disagree with you. And also because debate is much more interesting than a monologue. Besides which, heckling is a good Scottish occupation. The word to heckle comes from Dundee, where hecklers were lasses in the jute industry who used to comb out the jute fibres with combs called heckles, and they were hecklers. So that was their job, and they had a reputation for being politically rowdy and disorderly and yelling at politicians, and that's how the word heckler and to heckle came into the language. So if you wish to maintain that tradition, do feel free. And I would say, incidentally, I'm down in, when I got this invitation to speak, I was delighted. And I also said it'd be very easy for me because one of the many things I do in my life is I'm a director of the Eden Festival. So I was down here working on that for the last few days, and will still be here a couple of days more doing the wrap-up. One consequence of that is that I have spent most of the last 10 days up to my knees in mud. And I'm not somebody who spends a lot of time on personal grooming, largely because if you look like me in the first place, there's not much point. But if I am slightly more dishevelled than normal, do forgive me. And if my train of thought is even less logical and consistent than normal, please also forgive me, because I've had very little sleep over the last week, purely for reasons of work. I thought I would start by talking about some of my own life experience and some of the things I did, particularly in the Foreign Office, and what I saw there, because that's stuff on which I can give first-hand evidence, if you like, and experience which nobody else has, things you can't learn first-hand from anybody else. And then after that, I will go on to develop some thoughts which are based on my experience, but are my thoughts on how the world might be better organised politically, let me put it that way. Thoughts on the future and what we ought to do. And there, my view is no better than your view. My voice is one voice, and I'm no more entitled to say what our future should be than you are. So I like to sort of split it into two parts like that, and I hope that the first part explains where I'm coming from in my current political views. I joined the Foreign Office straight from Dundee University. I actually had no thoughts of being a diplomat at all. I'd never even considered being a diplomat. Most people don't. I don't know how many of you have ever thought you might be a diplomat, but I promise you, I had never thought of it as a job any more than you had. Then I was at university in my third year, I think, and a girl I fancied asked me if I was going to sit the civil service exams. And I said, are you? And she said, yes. I said, oh, I am too, yes. And I applied purely because I wanted to go along to the exam with her, and that's the honest truth. And such is the whim of God that I passed and she failed. It's a shame because she really wanted to be a diplomat and probably would have been much better than me. But anyway, I got through the civil service selection board. I got into the Foreign Office, and I did okay there. I found it suited me. I had many experiences there, and many very interesting jobs. I served in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Poland. Perhaps the most fulfilling job I had was as the head of the Foreign Office's maritime section, where I negotiated most of the UK's boundaries with our neighbours. I negotiated the UK-Ireland boundary, for example. I negotiated the boundary between the Shetland and the Faroe Islands. And if you move that boundary 1 mile that way or 1 mile that way, you're talking of $5 billion worth of oil and gas between the Shetlands and the Faroes. I should say you're moving it a mile, but it's a boundary that's 150 miles long. So I had a fascinating time, and I was thought to be reasonably good at it all. And I ended up as Britain's youngest ambassador, appointed at the age of 42, going off to Uzbekistan, which may sound obscure, but when you consider it borders Afghanistan, and that we were, at the time of my appointment, at war in Afghanistan, it was quite a responsible position to have. And I should say I had not had a great many doubts about the Foreign Office or the United Kingdom in the earlier part of my career. I had never felt I was doing something that was fundamentally wrong. In the first year I was in the FCO, when I was working on South Africa, that was a difficult period for me because Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, and Margaret Thatcher was, to say the least, extremely sympathetic towards apartheid. But I was working in the FCO, where by and large, the large majority of us were not at all sympathetic towards apartheid. And we were doing our best to move Number 10 and the UK away from that position. And one thing that often surprises people about me, because I have very firm opinions, and people assume that because I have very firm opinions, I don't like people who have different opinions. Well, that's actually not true at all. And I often have a lot of respect for people who have completely different political opinions to me. And I should say that at that period, the junior minister I worked directly to was Malcolm Rifkind. And he actually showed enormous courage and selflessness in that he definitely at that time damaged his own career, and principle in standing up to Thatcher and opposing her pro-apartheid views. And Malcolm Rifkind ended up being someone, I know he's done some bad things since, and I disagree with him totally on many things, including Scottish independence, but I saw a side of him there which was good and decent. And I had the opportunity in my career to work quite closely with many ministers of different colours. I worked quite closely with Robin Cook, and he was a man for whom I had a great deal of time in many ways. He was completely undercut by Tony Blair. In fact, in the very first week of the new Labour government, Cook tried to stop the sale of Hawk jets to Indonesia, where the Indonesian government was using them to bomb civilians in East Timor, where there was an independence movement. And Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and the involvement of Gordon Brown is interesting. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown ambushed Robin Cook at a cabinet meeting in order to get the sale of those Hawk jets to Indonesia railroaded through. And there was a bust-up about it. And Blair and Brown told Cook, in effect, that if he thought his ethical foreign policy was going to be any more than window dressing, particularly if he thought it was going to stifle the interests of the British armaments industry, he had another thing coming. And I was actually involved in that personally in the Foreign Office. And I saw through Tony Blair from his first week in office. I saw what he really was. I think the rest of the country eventually saw what he really was a few years later. But Blair was not a good man. So if you work somewhere like the Foreign Office, you have these moral dilemmas, let me put it that way. But by and large, on the whole, I didn't feel that it was a bad place to work or I was doing bad things by working there. That changed when I got to Uzbekistan, because the Uzbek dictatorship was an awful dictatorship, really terrible dictatorship. And we were backing it. The Uzbek dictatorship was providing military bases to both the Americans and the Germans to use in bombing Afghanistan, in return for which they were receiving a great deal of military aid. And there was what they called security service cooperation, which again involved financial payments and exchange of intelligence. And the intelligence came from the Uzbek torture chambers. There's no doubt about that. And I was seeing the intelligence, which was being procured by the Uzbeks and issued by the CIA and issued by MI6. And I, through a variety of ways, which due to shortage of time, I won't tell you now, but you can buy my books. If you buy Murder in Samarkand, you'll discover how. I was able to show for certain it was obtained through torture. And I complained to London that we were getting intelligence from torture. This was illegal in terms of the United Nations Convention on Torture. And I was called back to a meeting in London in March of 2003. And at that meeting I was told that Jack Straw, as Foreign Secretary, had taken the decision that we should get intelligence from torture in the context of the war on terror. And the second thing I was told by Sir Michael Wood, the Foreign Office's chief legal advisor, who was there at the meeting, and he told me that it's not illegal for us to get intelligence from torture as long as we don't do the torturing or specifically ask that a specific individual is tortured. But if the Uzbeks or the Saudis or the Bahrainis torture people and give us the resulting intelligence, that's perfectly legal. And that remains the position of the Foreign Office. That remains the position of the British government. And if you look at their official, it's called the Consolidated Cabinet Office Guidance on Torture, it states we do not condone or encourage torture. And it's just another weasel-worded way of saying the same thing. We didn't ask for it to happen. What the guidance does not say is we do not receive intelligence of torture, because they do all the time, and especially from Saudi Arabia, and especially from countries like Bahrain. But the other thing I learned, which is absolutely crucial, is torture does not get you the truth. You do not learn the truth through torture. What you learn from torture is what the torturer wants to hear. And if the torturer is the Saudi Arabian government, they don't want to hear the truth. The Saudi Arabian government has no interest in the truth. They have a story they wish to spin, a story that says any democratic opposition in Saudi Arabia is terrorist and Al-Qaeda or whatever. So the intelligence which we receive is simply putting the best gloss on our horrible allies. And it's circular. You know, we say, yes, we need this torture to fight terrorism, and it justifies itself. It's self-justifying. And my favourite example of this was I very often knew, when I was seeing the torture, because I was on the ground in Uzbekistan, learning and understanding the country and what was really happening. And I very often saw this intelligence coming from the Uzbek security services, and I knew it wasn't true. I just knew it did not square with the facts on the ground. My favourite example of this was where I received some intelligence which said that a professor in Tashkent was a member of Al-Qaeda. And I knew the man. And I'd actually had dinner with him. And he was a Jehovah's Witness. There are not many Jehovah's Witnesses in Al-Qaeda. I actually don't even imagine Al-Qaeda try and recruit Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm quite sure the Jehovah's Witnesses would try and recruit Al-Qaeda if they could find them. It was nonsense. It was absolute nonsense. But when I told the Foreign Office in MI6 it was nonsense, I was told it was very useful. And of course it was useful because it spanned the tale they wanted to spin. And the tale they wanted to spin was that Al-Qaeda was massive in Central Asia, and that justified their aid to the dictatorship as fighting Al-Qaeda, even though Al-Qaeda hardly really existed. It also justified their attempts to get oil and gas contracts in Central Asia, because that's what was at the root of much of it. And the contract for extraction of Central Asian gas was given to a company called Enron, who you may have heard of, closely linked to the Bush family. So I saw all this, and I didn't know what to do. I mean, I'd been told to shut up. I'd been told that torture was legal, and I wasn't certain what I would do. I didn't blow the whistle. I'd sent 2 major written telegrams, as we call our reports back in the Foreign Office, back to Jack Straw personally, top secret, as ambassador, telling him this is happening. Did it twice, and was told in effect to shut up about it. But everything I'd done on it had been top secret. I hadn't told anybody outside the Foreign Office. And I had to make a decision as to whether I could carry on or not. And strangely enough, I never got to make that decision, because I was called back from holiday in Canada to the personnel department. A chap in the personnel department who I actually knew, his name was Howard Drake. I knew him quite well because I had taken over from him as the head of the Cyprus section of the Foreign Office at an earlier stage in my career. And when you take over from someone in the FCO, you sit at the same desk for a week doing a handover. So I knew him fairly well from that. And he said to me, Craig, we understand you're having a lot of difficulties with the policy in Uzbekistan, and you don't agree with the torture policy, you don't agree with war in Iraq, so wouldn't it be better if we pulled you out of the troubled area? The ambassadorship in Copenhagen is coming due soon. That's a nice place to live. There are no difficult issues particularly. Why don't you resign as ambassador in Tashkent? We'll appoint you to Copenhagen, and there'll be no stain, bad mark on your personnel file. And I thought about it, and I said, can you give me a day or 2 to think about it? And he said, yes. He said, but I also have to tell you this. And he literally, from his desk drawer, he was sitting there, and he opened his desk drawer, he pulled out a paper, and he handed it to me. And he said, if you don't accept we're going to have to investigate these charges against you. And I just felt like I'd been hit in the face. I was just absolutely astonished. And there were 18 charges on this charge sheet against me, one of which said I was a habitual alcoholic, which, as you can all see, cannot possibly be true. I'm not a habitual alcoholic, I'm an amateur. One of which said I'd issued visas in exchange for sex. One of which said I had driven a Land Rover down a flight of stairs, which I thought sounded quite, quite James Bondish. But the truth is, actually, because my eyesight is so bad, I don't have a driving license and have never driven a car in my life, which is something you would have thought they would have found out before they made that particular.
I would explain why you headed down the stairs then.
You're right. There were 18 of them. And they were nonsense. I mean, they really absolutely were nonsense. And that, of course, got me into a fight with them, because if he'd left me for a couple of days and said, because I knew, I mean, my career was coming to an end over this argument with the office over torture. They knew I wasn't on the same page with them, with New Labour, if you like, with the Foreign Office over torture, over the invasion of Iraq. And I had to basically decide, in effect, I knew that if I didn't accept their offer of Copenhagen, my career was effectively at an end, and that's a big decision to make when you're in your 40s and you've got a family and kids and everything to look after. I might well have accepted Copenhagen. I just don't know. But the moment they tried to blackmail me, there's no way I was bloody going to accept Copenhagen. You cannot blackmail me. That's something I would never, ever, ever accept. So I became, and that's why I turned whistleblower in effect. And it wasn't from my genuine and profound moral indignation at what they were doing. It was their attempt to blackmail me over my opposition to it that made me think, these people have to be stopped. And I then turned whistleblower, became briefly famous. Alistair Campbell, in fact, leaked the details of the allegations against me to the Daily Mail. And so Ambassador issues visa for sex was all over the Daily Mail the next day. I went through a very difficult time. I fought them for a year. In the end, I was cleared formally of all charges. I was cleared of all the charges. Only 2 went to a hearing. The charge I was a habitual alcoholic came down to 4 members of staff who said that one day I had walked into the visa section and said, "My God, I've got a hangover," which is quite possibly true. If anyone in their life has never done anything like that, they've led a dull life. It's perfectly possible I had a hangover one day. I'm not saying I didn't, and I didn't remember the incident, and I was quite probably joking, because I used to joke with the staff. It was a sort of morale-raising thing. So I was quite probably exaggerating or joking, but it's quite possible that is true. And the second one, I actually can't remember the second one that came to a hearing, but it was a nonsense. But I was found not guilty of those at the hearing, and eventually I was cleared of everything, but I was found guilty of breaking the instruction not to tell anybody about the charges, because the charges against me were an official secret. And I had sought witnesses to say that the charges were untrue. Of the kind you would. On some of the incidents alleged to have happened, other people were there that day, including the incident with the Land Rover, for example. I'd found the other 3 people who were there gave statements to say it had never happened. And they said, but how did those people know about the charge? And I was found guilty of giving away the official secret of the charges against me. Now, what kind of Kafkaesque state are we living in? But I wasn't actually sacked. I was given a final written warning for that. But I left shortly thereafter. And whether I was sacked or whether I quit, I'm not actually that bothered which way you put it. But I will say, which I think says something as to how strong their case was, that I left with 7 years' salary as a final payoff, which was and I should say further, one thing I haven't told you, this all made me very, very ill. The stress of it made me terribly ill. I developed a heart and lung condition. I was diagnosed with pulmonary hypertension. In 2003, I was told I had between 6 months and 3 years to live. And that was what made me agree the compromise payoff, and I took 7 years' salary and left on the grounds I wasn't expecting to live anyway. About 2 months after that, I was called into St Thomas's Hospital in London to see a doctor, and the doctor said, I'm very sorry, Mr Murray, I've got very serious news for you. I said, what is it? He said, you were misdiagnosed, you're not going to die. and he looked so miserable and upset. I think he was scared that I was going to sue him, but I was just delighted. I was absolutely. So it turned out I didn't actually have pulmonary hypertension. I developed these problems through extreme stress, but it wasn't the irreversible scenario that is pulmonary hypertension. And I'm still here, which is good. And the moral of that story is, if your doctor tells you to die, don't obey him. Just carry on yourself. So that's when I turned whistleblower. And it wasn't just what they did to me, which was awful, to be honest. It was much worse, what they did to other people, all the hundreds of people who were tortured in places like Uzbekistan and Saudi Arabia. And the fact we got into the Iraq War, I used to be head of the FCO section of the Embargo Surveillance Centre, which is the body which was monitoring Iraqi weapons procurement. I knew David Kelly slightly, not well, but I knew him. I knew many of the other experts. That was a few years before. That was between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. It was a few years before the second Gulf War, but I still had met all the people and knew them and whatever. When the dossier on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction came out, I met Bill Patey, who at that stage was the head of the Middle Eastern Department of the Foreign Office. Bill was, like me, ex-Dundee University. And I said to Bill in the corridor that morning, I said to him, Bill, what's all this about Iraqi WMD? There's nothing I don't know, is there? Nothing's happened recently. I said, what? It can't be true, can it? And he just laughed and said, of course not, Craig, it's bollocks. Bill Patey's now Sir William Patey, went on to become British ambassador in Iraq and British ambassador in Afghanistan. And he's not a bad person at all. He's a very, very nice person. And one thing which the whole experience left me not understanding was how people I knew who were my colleagues and friends, who were not bad people at all, went along with it. And they knew, all the people who signed up to the dossier on Iraqi WMD, every single one of them knew it wasn't true. And I say that from certain knowledge, it's not conjecture. I know they knew it wasn't true. Why did they do it? I mean, the official answer, of course, is we're only civil servants, we do what ministers tell us, we don't make the moral choices. Ministers make the choices, we do our job. But when they're telling you to, receive intelligence from torture or start a war on false pretenses, surely at some stage people should say, I'm not doing that. And they didn't. And that's very, very hard to come to terms with. And it wasn't because they're bad people. And weirdly enough, and I'm not saying it's on the same scale, but I do think morally it is the same thing. I'd served in Poland, I told you, and one of the things I had to do in Poland a great deal was take people official visitors around the concentration camps, which I always found very harrowing duty to have to do, because just being in those places once is awful, and to have to do it repeatedly was really unpleasant. And I was also involved in the 50th anniversary commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz. And one of the things that came over to me was all the people who had collaborated in running the concentration camp system, because it involved hundreds of thousands of people. It wasn't just a few camp guards and things. So all the bureaucrats who processed it, the financiers, the crematorium, the plans for the crematoria, where they burnt all the bodies, were designed by Siemens and had the Siemens logo on. All the people who did all the infrastructure, they all knew what they were doing. And they were by and large just ordinary people like you and me too. And realizing how when human society goes wrong, it's ordinary people who don't stand up, and how normal that is. And I'd say, I'm not saying that the invasion of Iraq, the whole Al-Qaeda thing, the invasion of Afghanistan was as bad as Nazi Germany, but it was to me recognisably on the same spectrum. And having seen people who are good people not stand up against evil, I feel I have an understanding how it happens. And that led me to think an awful lot about the role of the state and whether the state is a good thing. And particularly whether the UK state that I'd been working for was a good thing. And I came to the conclusion it wasn't, that the UK state was involved in banditry and unlawful, illegal arms wars to grab resources, and to grab resources for the benefit of a small and very wealthy elite of people. And it wasn't really something I could go along with. Now, when I'd been at university, I'd been a great friend exaggerated, but I'd been good friends with Gordon Wilson, who was then leader of the SNP. And Gordon had convinced me that Scottish independence was a good thing back in about 1978, 79. In those days, I was a liberal. And one of the things I hate about modern politics is the fact had the liberals, who were the champions of home rule, and being a liberal was the opposite of being a unionist, historically, that the liberals have suddenly metamorphosized over the last 20 years into a unionist party, which to anyone who understands history, is dreadful. And I hadn't realised in all my years abroad how much the Liberal Party had changed while I was away. But anyway, when I knew Gordon, I was still a Liberal, but that wasn't viewed as particularly incompatible with a belief in Scottish independence. And anyway, a belief in Scottish independence was viewed as eccentric in those days, and not a realistic prospect. But I'd always believed in it and stuck with it. And I'd actually had the honour, I think is the word, to turn down 3 medals during my Foreign Office career. I was offered the OBE for my work on the Embargo Surveillance Centre, and I was offered 2 strange medals, the Lieutenancy of the Royal Victorian Order for organising the Queen's state visit to Poland, and to be a commander of the Royal Victorian Order for organising the Queen's state visit to Ghana. And I'd refused all of them. And when in Ghana, I had a personal one-on-one audience with the Queen. I think Prince Philip was probably lurking then too, but it was just me and them, for a few minutes for them to thank me for organising the state visit for them. And the Queen said to me, Mr. Murray, she said, we've noticed you always refuse honours. Is there any particular reason for that? I said to her, Your Majesty, I said, I'm a Scottish nationalist and a Republican. And she looked at me in astonishment, I think it was, because I'm not sure anybody had ever said that to her. That there are hundreds of people employed to make sure nobody ever gets near enough to her to say something like that. And she looked at me in astonishment, and she said, how nice. Which was the last time I saw her. But I've not been, I've been staunch, if you like, to my nationalist views, but I had concluded, as a result of all of this, that the role that the UK plays in the world, as in many ways just an acolyte of the United States, but also as a post-imperialist power on its own, is evil. And that the only way to shock the UK into behaving in a better way is to split up the UK. And that to split up the UK would not only provide a better future for Scotland, it would also, hopefully, provide the shock, shake the kaleidoscope that would enable politics to change down in England. Because I should say, when I got into anti-war campaigning and things as a result of everything I've told you, I became good personal friends with Jeremy Corbyn. I spoke on the platform with him several times. I'm as good friends with him as I can be ever with anybody who never drinks. I always got on fairly well with him. And my answer to people who say, if you take Scotland out of the equation, then you're abandoning England to Tory government, is no. If you take Scotland out of the equation, you're breaking up the UK, and the psychological effect on the Tories is going to shock England out of Toryism for years and years to come. Breaking up the United Kingdom is the way not just to get Scotland independent, it's the way to rattle England out of its Tory complacency. That's my view of the matter. So I started spending more time. I should explain, my father was from Edinburgh. He was in the Air Force, so I was born in Norfolk. Which is why I have this accent. I grew up largely in Norfolk. Then I moved back up here for university. I then lived mostly abroad, of course. And then I returned to live here for the independence referendum. I left the Liberals once the coalition got going in 2011. I left the Liberals and immediately joined the SNP back in 2011. Kept spending more time up here campaigning. And in 2013, as the sort of referendum loomed, I found myself more or less living here the whole time and campaigned fairly well full-time through the entire referendum campaign. My wife wasn't at all sure about coming to live in Edinburgh, but eventually they came up in January 2014 and joined me, and we're now back established. And I now live literally 100 yards from where my father was born, so I feel I've sort of gone full circle and feel happy to be back. But I don't want Scottish independence so that Scotland can be a small model of what the UK is. I don't want, it's not that just that I don't want a Scotland which has nuclear weapons. I don't want a Scotland which has nuclear weapons. I don't want a Scotland that's in NATO. I want us to be neutral. Scotland does not have enemies. One thing I can promise you, 100% for certain, is that nobody in the Kremlin is sitting there thinking, how do we invade Scotland? This is some weird thing in our psyche. And it comes from a UK imperialist psyche that there has to be an enemy. There has to be an enemy to justify the profits of the arms trade and the role of the military and the reason for our vastly inflated security services. Scotland does not have enemies. Scotland has a very proud tradition of military forces, and I have no objection at all to our maintaining military forces, but we should put them at the disposal of United Nations peacekeeping forces. Do you know which country in the world has the most troops in various United Nations peacekeeping forces around the world?
China.
Ghana, in fact. Ghana has more than anyone, amazingly. And Ghana's a small country, but they have very good, well-maintained forces, and they have them in 8 different peacekeeping forces around the world. China also has many. But the United Nations is always short of good troops, because most countries wish to keep them to fuel their own paranoid fantasies of pointing at each other. Scotland could use its military prowess largely at the service of the United Nations. but we don't need to be part of some fantastical imperialist power struggle. There's an article today, in fact, in The Guardian, where The Guardian claims to have leaked documents revealing Russia's secret plans for influence in Africa. And it says that this includes bribing politicians, this includes building infrastructure for African countries in order to get influence, this includes undermining political opponents of Russia within African governments by various political manoeuvres, and this includes use of aid money, this includes supply of weapons, this includes trying to put military bases there, and this is written up in The Guardian as a massive scoop about how dreadful Russia is. But I did every single one of those things when I was Deputy Head of the Foreign Office's Africa Department. I did every one of those things on a scale at least 10 times as large as Russia is doing. And it amazes me that people can write this stuff and they don't see that. The idea that the world is full of goodies and baddies, and we're the goodies of the white hats and we never do anything wrong, and the Russians are the baddies with the black hats and they're terrible and everything they do is wrong, even if it's the same thing that we do, it's for the birds. And I want to see Scotland come out of that. You know, I don't want to see Scotland as a player on one side of wars and power games. I cannot think of any reason for Scotland ever to go to war with anybody. I really can't. And as I say, I think the chances of our being invaded are pretty well nil. And that's my view of foreign policy. Now, I want to see us as a force for peace and good in the world. I want to see us contribute to the United Nations. I want to see us uphold international law. You know, the Chagos Islands is a perfect example of what's wrong with the UK and why we shouldn't be part of the UK. The UK just lost a decision at the International Court of Justice 13-1 on UK possession of the Chagos Islands, a colonial possession we refused to give back, and where we deported the entire population. We deported the entire population as recently as 1971, and where we deported them after gassing all their animals and pets in order to try to terrify them into leaving of their own free will, and where we have refused to let them back for 50 years, despite continual defeats at the United Nations. Now finally it's gone to the International Court of Justice, and the UK says it's not going to acknowledge it. We've given up on international law. We are becoming a US-type rogue state that considers itself not beholden to international law. I want to see a Scotland that upholds the institutions of international law, that obeys the International Court of Justice. And we can play a very positive role internationally in the way, to be frankly, that Ireland does. Ireland has a great deal of respect in international organisations, like which I always found in my own work at United Nations conferences and things. And then in the social field, the United Kingdom, according to the latest Forbes wealth list, which came out and was announced on the BBC about a month ago, the UK now has 152 billionaires. 152 billionaires in a country where we have 4 million children living in poverty, in a country where we have food banks, and people going to food banks include people in working full time, who can't feed their families. And we have 152 billionaires. Frankly, I want to see a country with no billionaires at all. Nobody needs £1 billion. And anybody who tells you that you would stifle inventiveness, you would stifle entrepreneurship if people could only have 800 million quid, I find somewhat hard to believe. And the truth is that these vast accumulations of wealth are leading us into a more and more unequal society. In this society, where young people in particular are finding it harder and harder to get careers and jobs that lead anywhere, where people are suffering from, exploitation. And we are fortunate in Scotland that we have been comparatively immune. And I say comparatively because we can't pretend it doesn't exist. We have been comparatively immune here to the wave of racism, which I see all the time down in England when I'm there. And it's the easiest trick and the oldest trick in the politician's book to say to somebody, you are not starving, you are hungry. Your children are not adequately clothed. You can't afford to go on holiday. You don't have a decent job. You don't have a permanent contract. All of this is not the fault of the billionaire who employs you. It's the fault of that poor immigrant over there. Because that's what politics has become. There are many decent arguments for leaving the European Union. There are respectable arguments for leaving the European Union. But those respectable arguments are not what drove Brexit. What drove Brexit was anti-immigrant racism. And that's just being whipped up to an extent I find extremely, I find it difficult to believe that the things which are happening now are happening in a country which I live in. We've got Conservative leadership candidates talking of proroguing Parliament in order to be able to pass things without Parliament say so. We've got people talking about even further tax breaks for the wealthy, as if our society wasn't already unequal enough. And we've got a society in which disabled people, commit suicide because they can't afford to live. How can that happen in a country as wealthy as this is? And Scotland has the ability to break away from this. One thing I will never, ever understand is how they manage psychologically to convince Scots that they are uniquely incapable in Europe of running their own country. Scots invented central banking. The Bank of England and the Bank of France, the first two central banks in the world, were both founded by Scots. And yet they've convinced us we couldn't manage our own currency. How does that happen? Independence is normal. If you're a small European nation, the norm is to be an independent state. And it's not hard, it's not difficult. If the Irish can do it, why do we think we can't? It's a question it genuinely astonishes me that people have been scared off independence on the grounds we're not capable of it. Yes.
You mentioned Alistair Campbell a little while ago, and he's always been very insidious influence on politics when he was, a force now. And deeply gutted by his own admission of what he did to you, but he also did it when unelected, and he had such an influence on people's opinions. Do you think Scottish politicians are too nice?
I think, quite a lot of Scottish politicians are not too nice. I was very angry when Nicola Sturgeon published that smiling photo of herself and Alistair Campbell. That to me was daft. But I was equally angry when she posted a tweet saying we should all read a book by Henry Kissinger. My own view, and I have the great advantage that no one employs me, and I have no position, so no one can sack me. My own view, she's just far too establishment-minded and far too attracted to power and the powerful, and far too, keen to be liked by the Guardian, and generally not rebellious enough, or not radical enough, not sufficiently focused on Scottish independence. That's my view. I think that's maybe that photo of Nicola and Alistair Campbell was what you were hinting at when you were asking the question. He's a war criminal. He was involved in drafting that, sexing up further that dossier specifically to start an illegal war. And he should be in jail in The Hague for the rest of his life. And nobody should ever, under any circumstances, have their photo taken with Alistair Campbell. That's Scotland has a much more communal attitude to politics, and that's what that was behind Scotland's long adherence to the Labour Party. It's what underlies the thought, of the 2014 referendum. And for me, that referendum was absolutely fascinating because it really was a street movement. It was a movement which brought people together in communal ways and continues to do so. And it is actually not easy on any other subject anymore to get this many people into a hall together. It's not easy to do. People live much more isolated lives than they used to. People live as consumers in front of the TV, eating their supper, watching telly. It's fairly common for people not even to know who their neighbours are. The world has changed in that way. And the Scottish independence referendum, it brought people together to discuss the future as though everyone has a common stake and a right to decide the future. And that's something which had rather gone out of society. And I hope that coming together to meetings like this helps enhance social friendships. But the idea of community is very strong in Scotland. And I think we do have the chance to build a country in which economic and social relationships are not entirely based on the kind of neoliberal model that has been pursued by the United Kingdom. So, again, I want an independent Scotland to be a fundamentally different place to the UK. A much kinder, friendly, more communitarian-based place. And that, for me, that's a goal. We have tremendous resources. We have one of the best educated populations in the world. We have some of the best universities in the world. We have incredible potential in renewable energy, which is going to be vital in the future. We have great agriculture. We desperately need land reform. Being down this neck of the woods is quite interesting because it reminds me of, I told you I used to be liberal, it reminds me of Gladstone, who, one of his best phrases I thought was he was talking with Duke of Buccleuch, and he said he sits in Drumlanrig, which is the great dunghill of Scotland. That was Gladstone's description of Drumlanrig. Gladstone's in the same speech, Gladstone talked of the British invasion of Afghanistan, in what was, I think, the second Afghan war. And Gladstone talked of an incident where British troops, one of thousands and thousands of such incidents in the history of the British Empire, Gladstone talked of an incident where British troops had burned down an Afghan village and forced the population to flee into the hills, very similar to Glencoe. And Gladstone said in the speech which he gave in Parkhead, he said that the humble half of the Afghan is as sacred as yours and mine, and we have driven their wives and children into the snows of winter. And then Gladstone said, if they resist, would you not do the same? If they resist, would you not do the same? And that interests me because Gladstone at the time was leader of the opposition fighting in the general election. And he was saying that the people fighting British troops were in the right. Now, can you imagine what would happen if Jeremy Corbyn or Nicola Sturgeon said that people fighting British troops in Afghanistan or Iraq were right to fight British troops. You couldn't say it anymore, could you? You couldn't say it anymore, even though it's self-obviously bloody true. If an Iraqi or an Afghani invaded my country, I would fight him. Why would we expect them to be any different? But the interesting thing is, Gladstone won that election, that the space of intellectual debate which is allowed, the ability to criticise your own country's policy and the ability to criticise your own country's armed forces is less now than it was at the height of the British Empire. And that's a very, very scary thought indeed. But lady, there, I have a question.
Sorry, it's my question.
Yeah.
Just sticking back to, because you mentioned Duke of Buccleuch last year when you were speaking at Dumfries.
Aye.
And it, well, I'll just fire right into the question, Craig.
Yeah.
How would you propose dealing with the land imbalance in an independent Scotland where the Duke of Buccleuch and the Crown Estates are in the firing range, shall we say?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would do is I would give, on agricultural land, I would give all agricultural land to the tenant farmers who rent it.
Okay.
Simply give, with no compensation. That's what I would do. I would give the land to the farmers. And that, I think, is the first and easiest part of the equation. Because no one, I actually don't care who the Duke of Buccleuch's great-great-great-great-grandfather killed, or whose great-grandfather married.
Yeah.
He's got no right to all that land. Nobody has any right to all that land. And I don't want to take it into public ownership. I don't think that'll be any good. The obvious thing to do is give it to the people who rent it and farm it. Give it to the actual farmers. That'd be the first step I'd do in agricultural land. The second thing, of course, is with there's huge amounts of land in the Highlands which is kept as grouse-moor, which doesn't have to be grouse-moor, which used to support vast populations of cattle historically, and which could do so again, and on which there aren't tenant farmers to give it to, but which could have farmers. But I would break it up into, I would keep it private, break it up into much smaller private farms. That's essentially my radical suggestion.
So just on that same sort of thread, recently the Duke of Buccleuch has sold over 2,500 acres or 25,000 acres in Canonby. I think the deal has gone through this month. With that in mind, and also the selling of land and property by the Crown Estate, personally I think that indicates that they're cashing in, they're selling up before something, the proverbial, in a way, the shit hits the fan and Scotland changes a tack that they don't, that the landed don't like. So to me they're just cashing in somehow and getting out of Dodge.
That's quite possibly true.
I was just going to say, if you do that and break up into smaller chunks and give it back to the farmers and stuff like that, how do you stop them, becoming wealthy and buying it back off each other again until you get to a position where one person owns all the land again? Is that what happened in the first place?
Well, no, I mean, the vast estates mostly came from the process of abolition of Ronald Reagan old-fashioned farm plans and the enclosure movement of the 18th and 19th centuries. I don't think, consolidation would be a danger, but you're not going to have that kind of land grab, if you like, in the way you did then. And consolidation through natural commercial processes could happen, but I think it would take a vast time. And I'm not even sure.
No, I disagree with that.
I'm not even sure it would be that economically viable to do if you didn't have it all to start with.
I think the system in Norway is so much of that.
Yeah.
They limit the amount of land that anyone
person can
So
have.
you could legislate for it though.
Yeah. I also like the Danish system in many ways, where basically non-EU nationals pay massive land taxes, and that's rather good. Yeah, if I'm completely out of the way. Let me, but the fact we're talking about this is important because and it could be, and I said to you, I'm not a farmer. I'm not. I look like a farmer, but I'm not a farmer. I'm not a land reform expert. But at the moment, in the United Kingdom, the chance of redressing any of these imbalances, and the fact that one thing Scots everywhere feel so strongly about is all the land that's been stolen from us and from our ancestors and forced into vast estates, the Highland clearances, the lowland clearances, everything that goes with that. The fact that in the United Kingdom we would have no chance of ever doing anything about it, whereas in an independent Scotland we could decide what to do about it. That is the real ties that we have to get at. And that goes to, same with the monarchy. I don't want a monarchy. Some people might want a monarchy, but we could decide for ourselves. Yes?
How would you get rid of Scotland's debt? The biggest in Europe, 15 billion.
15 billion's not a huge amount per capita. In terms of percentage of GDP, it's not massive at all. I'm not sure 15 billion's quite, but I should say I don't trust any of the unionist accounting, where we have systems where, for example, Crossrail enables you to take a train from Southend to Reading without getting off. And I'm sure there are people who want to take a trail from Southend to Reading without getting off, and I'm very happy for them. But that counts as United Kingdom expenditure because it's in London and it's the capital or whatever. It doesn't count as expenditure against Scotland. VAT receipts in Scotland, officially Scotland's VAT receipts are less than Ireland's VAT receipts, even though we have a bigger economy and larger population. And that's to do with how they're accounted for by the Treasury between England and Scotland. It's not in real life we wouldn't have lower VAT receipts than Ireland. I actually don't. I distrust entirely. Having been in Whitehall and a member of the senior civil service for 6 years, I wouldn't trust any figures that the UK government throws out about Why would we not be able to succeed when the Danes can? Why would we not be able to succeed when the Swedes can? We are not different. We are a normal, perfectly capable bunch of people. And I'd also say, I only have limited sympathy with getting deeply into financial arguments anyway. Because the purpose of independence is not to be wealthier. We may become wealthier, that would be nice, but that is not the reason we want to do it. We want to do it because we want to be free, not because we want to be rich.
I think when I'm asked questions like that, I like to make an analogy of would you go jobbing with a guy who, when it comes to getting the payment, he goes and speaks to the person who's paying you, counts it behind your back, and then says that was your share, that's exactly half of what I got. You know what I mean? That's the analogy I use for the UK economy thing.
I think that's entirely fair. I want to make one more point before I finish. And this is maybe a bit more controversial in some ways, and it's a bit more controversial among people who support independence. I don't think we will ever see 2014 again. I think the British government only let us have a referendum in 2014 because they didn't think there was a chance in hell we would win. They were very, very confident. And we started, remember, at 30% of the vote. We finished on 45. I've got no doubt whatsoever we would win another referendum. If you held it in 3 weeks' time, I've no doubt we would win it. We would win it. Because once we get campaigning, the numbers will shoot up again. And also because the UK is falling apart anyway. But I don't think they're going to give us that chance. I think they'll do everything they possibly can now to hang on to their resources. I think they see the chance of Scotland and its resources being taken away from the UK as an existential threat. And I think we will see, not only will we see an attempt to block a referendum by not being given a chance to hold it, I think we will see every possible dirty trick in the security services army deployed against us. And that will probably include, as we get closer to however we achieve independence, for example, that will include acts of violence blamed on nationalists. It will include provocateurs. And I say, I was in the senior civil service in Whitehall for 6 years. I was at that rank in the Whitehall civil service. Anybody, and I worked with the security services quite closely because I was in the Foreign Office. And I should say that while I was ambassador in Uzbekistan, I knew an MI6 operative next door in Afghanistan named Rory Stewart. But there you are. Anybody who doesn't understand that there will be, even at quite senior levels in the SNP, long-term MO5 agents is naive. Because that's just how the security services operate. Why do you think they have a budget of in the case of MI5, £3.5 billion a year? What do you think they do with all that money? And remember, MI5 only operate within the United Kingdom. And anyone who thinks that you and I, those of us who support independence, are not viewed by them as a worthwhile target because we're an enemy of the United Kingdom, you're just wrong. You are. It doesn't mean they're going to come and shoot you, I'm not saying that. But you are a threat to them. And then, having been terrified in the last referendum, they're not going to allow us. They're going to do everything they can to stop us having another proper democratic vote. My own view is that we're going to probably end up by having to do something like have the SNP declare that the next Holyrood election is a referendum, and if they win, they will declare independence. Something along those lines. There are many ways to do it, and they're all perfectly legal. The vast majority of countries in the world have become independent during my lifetime. That's a strange thought, because we think countries... No, the first African country to become independent was Ghana. That became independent the year after I was born. All of the African countries, other than Ethiopia, has become independent in my own lifetime. It's also true of most of the countries in Asia. Almost none of them had a referendum to become independent. Almost none. I don't think any African country did until South Sudan recently. Same in Asia. In the European Union, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia all left the Soviet Union without a referendum. The Czech Republic and Slovakia split without a referendum. There was, I think, a referendum in Slovenia, but I think there wasn't one in Croatia. So almost all the European Union members, which have become independent in recent times, became independent without a referendum. There is no requirement in international law for a referendum. It is not the only route. In almost every single case, it was a vote of the local parliament which declared independence. And in almost every single case, it was illegal for them to declare independence in terms of the law of the country for which they were declaring independence. So, for example, the Baltic states declared independence from the Soviet Union with no legal cover at that time from Moscow. And in fact, the British government argued before the International Court of Justice when the British government was supporting the independence of Kosovo, that it didn't matter if the independence of Kosovo was illegal in Yugoslav law, because by definition, the British government used that word, by definition, the declaration of independence will almost always be illegal in the terms of the country from which it... So the idea that we need Westminster's authority is simply untrue in international law, and that's something I want to get over to people. And so we may end up doing this in a much more confrontational manner than we would wish, and we have to be prepared for that. Can I take some more?
Estonia became independent within 3 weeks. It had its own currency, I heard at the weekend.
Yeah.
And yet it's developed. an awful lot of IT stuff which are the envy of the rest of the world.
Yep.
And they have free education, free healthcare, and they operate their country very successful with 3 million people.
Yep.
Now that's a blueprint for how you can do it. But I'm really scared about this growth commission that the SNP have adopted. Derek Mackay says he's all for it. And the very idea that we would maybe have to wait 10 years or past 6 criteria before we could even think about getting our own currency seems nonsense. You're not independent if somebody else is controlling your finances.
I agree 100%. You're absolutely right. I think the Growth Commission is ridiculously conservative with a small c. And is predicated entirely on the idea that nothing changes and we just want to be like the UK, only with a different name.
We pay £5 billion
Yeah.
to the rest of the United Kingdom.
I was actually discussing it with Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister. And he said that Scotland has got one thing which none of these countries have ever had before. You've actually got your own banknotes already. You could do it quicker than a month. And it hadn't actually occurred to me. Of course, it's perfectly true. Because he said the biggest logistical problem is getting your banknotes printed. That's the hardest thing in launching your own currency. You've actually got them already. What's the problem? There you are.
Do you not think one of the problems is that a lot of people here don't really think Scotland is a nation? They think that Britain is the nation, and although they may say we're proud Scots and all the rest of it, the reason that they can't bring themselves to want independence is because they don't, in their heart, think Scotland is a nation. They think they're British. And how do you get around that? Because it's once you accept Scotland as a nation, then it follows that it should make its own decisions. But if you don't think Scotland's a nation, then that argument is lost.
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, Scotland is a nation, undoubtedly.
It is to us, but it isn't necessarily to everyone.
And was an independent nation state longer than it's been part of the United Kingdom. And the answer to part of that is education. It's also partly cultural. I always find it very peculiar that anyone who's been to both England and to Scotland thinks that they are the same country, because culturally they are miles apart in many, many ways. Other than the common language, there's very little that actually that binds them socially and culturally. So I agree. It's probably more difficult here than it is in Dundee. Would be my thinking, because naturally you're going to feel an affinity with such close neighbours. I think that's perfectly normal and a good thing in many ways. But part of it's history, and part of it is teaching and the school curriculum, and the number of things which people have. My latest book I'm writing is a biography of Lord George Murray, the Jacobite general. And one thing that astonishes me is just how much complete untruth has been taught about Jacobites for years and years and years and years. And the primary aim of the Scottish Jacobites was independence for Scotland. That's what they were fighting for. They weren't fighting out of a clan loyalty to the Stuarts. That's just not true at all. And they, I'm true of a minority of them, but it wasn't the prime motivator. And they actually repealed the Act of Union in Edinburgh, which is something which you're almost never told. If I had my notes, I'd give you the date on which they did it. They formally repealed the Act of Union in Edinburgh as their first act before they invaded England. They repealed the Act of Union. And essentially they insisted that unless Charlie agreed to the repeal of the Act of Union, they weren't going to invade England. And the main reason that they turned back from Derby wasn't fear of military defeat, although there was reason to fear military. That wasn't the main reason. They weren't really that interested on whether he was King of England or not. That wasn't what motivated them. And that's an example, if you like, of history being mistaught. Prosperity and no union was the Jacobite watchword. Almost none of that. We're told they were romantic people who believed in the divine right of kings, who were against parliamentary democracy, and they were all Catholics, all of which is untrue. The large majority of them were Protestants, and the large majority of them were actually more advanced Democrats than the people they were fighting. So one of the problems we have is we've been taught so many lies for so many generations, and that's a great difficulty we have. We actually don't know our own real history, but I'm working on that.
Did you know that the Russians gave snowplows to Ghana as overseas aid? I used to pass them every day.
Whereabouts in Ghana? Where?
Kumasi.
In Kumasi. I know Kumasi very well. My father actually lived in Kumasi for 6 years. I don't remember the snowplows, but I do believe you.
Russia gave snowplows to
Did you find when the EU appointed commissioners that they interfered with your work?
No. By and large, I always had a good relationship with the EU Commission in the countries I was in. In Poland, most of my work was involved in preparing Poland for EU membership. That's actually what I was doing. In fact, that's the one big argument I had with the Foreign Office in the earlier part of my career. Was I received a directive from London telling me I had to go and tell the Polish government that they had to reduce the size of the warnings on cigarette packets, because their warnings on cigarette packets were bigger than the EU agreed norm. And I just refused to do it. I said, I'm not doing it. I was the first secretary in those days. I went to see my ambassador, this very nice Welshman called Michael Llewellyn-Smith. I said to him, Michael, I don't know what to do about this. I've got this instruction to lobby the Poles to reduce the size of warning on their cigarette packets. I can't do that. He said, no. He said, and he looked at it. He's a very wise man. And he said, I know what. And he put it in the bin and he said, we'll just tell them you did it. Which was,
Craig, very personal question. How old are you?
60.
Right. So, will you go for a job as ambassador for Scotland when requires foreign ambassador?
Well,
Well, you're the man for the job. You're already trained. Get in there, man.
I would love to have a role in helping set up and train Scotland's own diplomatic service. I'd really love to do it. I'm not quite sure. I'm actually now, I'm British ambassadors, retired at 60, so and of course, it doesn't mean we have to follow that.
Wait till Atos come after you.
But I'd be very, very happy to. The other thing I really want to do is negotiate the UK-Scotland maritime boundary, because negotiating the maritime boundary that would be good to do. Because as I think many of you know, infamously, it currently heads up to north of Carnoustie, which is quite extraordinary. And I should say that they did that after I left as head of maritime section. I hadn't got away with it while I was there.
I was going to ask you that. No.
Jack Strong on London, that.
It was Donald Dewar, in fact. That was Donald Dewar. Which is why every time I see that statue of him in Glasgow, I feel furious. Father of the nation. He gave away 6,000 square miles of bloody oil field and gas field to England in exchange for, as a part of the deal for getting the assembly.
So what happened at Rockall? The Irish are going on about it. Who is Rockall? Who belongs to Rockall?
Rockall would belong to Scotland, I think, but Rockall doesn't actually really make any difference. It's a red herring, because you can't, an uninhabited rock, which is more than 12 miles from inhabited land, cannot generate a fishing zone, because no one lives on it. So, it would make no sense. And that's very plain in the law of the sea. And the question of continental shelf and mineral rights, once you're beyond 200 miles from the mainland, depends on geology. It's a matter of agreed geology of whose continental shelf it is stretching out from the mainland. So Rockall actually isn't a factor. It can't generate fishing rights, and its irrelevant to the determination of a continental shelf behind 200 miles. So it really, whoever owns Rockall actually makes no difference in terms of the law of the sea. Which is something I keep telling people, but they love just politicians. It's a good issue to have if you want to be patriotic and bang the drum, but actually it makes no difference to anyone.
Can you give an example of something you were just saying before about trying to change the sort of inbred sort of generational opinion? Okay. I was with a group of friends at Christmas. I play football with them every Monday. They're all walks of life, mostly self-employed, and they're not all Rangers fans, just before we say that. And I asked them, because obviously this is Christmas time and the whole Brexit mess was continuing to go on, and I said to them, I've been quite forefront and Scotland showed its independence, and I told them that I voted at the time, and I was told I was gutted at the time, but they never gave their opinion. And I said to them, I says, if you could go back now, knowing what's happened, knowing that the lies that were said, that if Scotland went independent, then it'd be forced out of the European Union, and then it'd be years before we get back in, and we'd lose out and all the the finance we get from them. And I said to them, would you now, all of you, change your mind? And they all said no. They'd still would still vote for us to be part of this union. And I was absolutely stunned by that response. And it dawned on me there and then that unfortunately, in this country, either it's maybe this area, either it's the psyche of some Scottish people, because they weren't all unionists. It's just something about them. It's something about a large swathe of Scottish people that either they don't have the confidence that they can go it alone, or they just feel more British than Scottish, as this gentleman was saying over here before. And as a result, the phrase "who dares wins," they don't want to dare. They're comfortable in the way of life that we have at the moment, and I think it has to then go back to, and hopefully it won't affect their children. Hopefully they'll come up not taking on their parents' point of view, that maybe they can see the reality and the hope that we could all have if this country went independent.
Questions of identity are difficult because you have questions of national identity, then you have questions of local identity, then you have questions of peer group identity. I get quite a strong feeling that there are subcultures here, if you like, or local identity cultures, particularly among young people, particularly among, you were saying football, it's very true in rugby, I find, that part of being part of that group is you are a unionist. It's unusual. If you look at the demographics of Scotland as a whole, and the breakdown of how people voted in the referendum, the vote among people under 40 was overwhelmingly yes. So in general, for people under 40 to be no, as a united group, it would 10 random Scots under 40 picked at random from the entire population. You'd find it very hard to find a group of 10 who were all no. But in certain areas and among certain demographics, you can find clusters, if you like, where their own subculture within themselves makes unionism a part of their felt
everybody
identity.
I was talking to was over 40.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay. Well, that might feed into it partly. Because the only age group which was overwhelmingly no was over 55s. Once you got to over 55s, you had an overwhelmingly no population. But every population under 55 was yes. But as you got up to the sort of over 70s, you were overwhelmingly no. Which led me to say, because I'm a terrible person, I said actually to Alex Salmon, don't worry, 2 hard winters and we're there. But countering local cultures, is a very, very difficult thing because it can be very much part of your identity. I told you I grew up in Norfolk. Everyone I knew had a deep hatred for everyone from Suffolk and anybody who supported Ipswich. And that was part of our local culture. It makes no sense. There's no rationality for it. But I shared in that as a teenager, because that was part of our local identity. And breaking through those things can be very, very difficult. And I suspect that's something of what we have going on. And as I say, an affinity with Britishness in a country, in a part of the country which is so close to the border, is natural and not a bad thing. And what they've got to, and part of the answer to that is the realization that being in a different country is not actually going to change anything in terms of your social relationships with people the other side of the border.
You put the nail right in the head there. I don't think it's so much about Britishness, it's about people that are doing quite well.
Yeah.
You said some of these people that are certain, they're getting on to middle age, they're self-employed, tradesmen that have done well, they don't want anything to change. You know what I mean?
And that's
it's to them they're doing okay. Why change?
Yeah, that's something absolutely true, and that's also very obvious in the demographics on voting. But the strongest support for independence is among people who are having the hardest time. Social groups D and E, as the pollsters have it. There's an overwhelming support for independence. And if you go into the wealthier suburbs of Edinburgh, where all the bankers and insurance people live, they're overwhelmingly against it because people, they fear that the apple cart might be upset. They're on the top of society at the moment. Maybe a social change will happen and they won't be on the top of society anymore. And again, these are natural and understandable human emotions, but we have to. I actually had my parents used to live in Inch's Wood in Culloden. To get to the nearest pub, you actually had to walk over Culloden Moor. Days before the National Trust walled it all off, which I should say is a total bloody disgrace. But to get to the pub, we actually had to walk across Culloden Moor, and a lot of my ancestors are buried at Culloden Moor, and the idea that my country, that my ancestors for generations and generations fought and died for the freedom and independence of Scotland, and somebody's worrying about, will I be 500 quid a year worth off? I don't care if you're going to be 500 quid. I don't care if I'm going to be 500 quid a year worth off. That is not what it's about. But it's getting that passion into people, which is the difficult thing.
I think when one of those footballers limp on the strength to break a leg and still in the area and they go to hospital and you get a bill for 40, 50, 60,000 pounds.
Yeah, that's true.
They might have a second thought.
Yeah, or when their parents are in care or whatever, which would cost you, hugely more if you were. Yeah, that's true. Are we coming to a close?
I think we'll probably need to before I need tea. We have to do the obligatory thank you very much. I'm sure we could probably have sat here and carried on for another 2 or 3 hours, but we'll all have to not, unfortunately, this time. Maybe next time you're down you can come and say hello to us all again. Hopefully with better news in the political world as well. We have cups of tea, hopefully, very shortly. We also have some biscuits and so on through there. We've got, I'm just going to miss out you for a wee second, we've got some flags for sale over there, because you've all got to now go home and wave your flag and engender this sense of community and Scotland and everything. There's some free badges, and at this side I'm at Craig at Galashiels, where we have the Let's Talk About the Border, which is being launched as a fundraiser to create a pack locally which will hopefully provide us with a source for the answers for all the questions that people ask about the border. So anyone that wants to have a look at that. And also, as we were mentioning, food banks, Mark Franklin's 25th book, signed, is also up here for anyone that wants one. If we can all just show our appreciation, thank you very much for